Warning. These stories depict scenes and scenarios that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. You're going to hell, child of Satan. You'll burn in agony. God will cast thee down into Jehani. Burn, witch. That's how I used to begin my morning. Every morning. I live in the same little townhouse that my mother lived in, and her mother before her. And for as long as I can remember, we've lived next to Miss Thompson, who is perhaps the nastiest person I've ever met. Her voice has assaulted my ears since childhood. Either she was yelling at my mother or antagonizing me while I played outside. I don't know how she came to the conclusion that we're witches, but no matter how kind we were to her, her words were always the same. Die, burn in hell, Satan's spawn, witches, bitches. So, every morning I'd walk to my car amid her screeching and try to tune it out as I prepared for the day. After all, it's no good coming into work at a tea house when you're stressed. Your foul mood will poison the tea. At least, that's what my mother always told me. Just like our home, the tea house has been in my family for generations. It is always owned and managed by a woman, and we never take employees. They just aren't needed. Besides, it's hard to teach a newcomer the finer points of tea making. Myself, I've been studying tea since I was a child, as my mother passed down her secrets to me. It's a wonderful job, a wonderful life, and I quite enjoy it. All except for Miss Thompson, of course. Every morning at the tea house was the same. I began by rinsing out the cast iron teapot and teacups. You can't use soap on them, and you can't wash the outside. You can only rinse them, and over time they'll take on the flavor of the teas you brew in them. Which is why I have a separate tea set for each kind of tea. Green, black, yellow, oolong, white, and herbal infusions. I'd set the metal teapots to brew hot water on the stove. You can't put cast iron on the stove either. While preparing the water, I'd select the teas I would feature that day. Of course, a customer can come in and request any kind of tea they like, but I always like to give my own recommendations. I would open the store at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'd spend the day serving tea. I had quite a few regular customers that enjoyed the healing properties of tea, perhaps with stomach problems who liked the jade mint oolong. People with stomach problems who liked the jade mint oolong. People with anxiety who preferred the chamomile blossom. People who simply enjoyed the traditional taste and brewing process of matcha. Well, one morning, someone new came into the tea house. Someone I never expected to see. Jamie Thompson. Miss Thompson's grandson, who spent most of his time caring for the aging crony, was standing at the front of my tea house, watching me serve mango black tea to a few elderly tourists looking for something sweet and strong. Miss Morney, I see your tea's doing well, he began. I noticed the elderly woman staring at him in open appreciation. He was quite handsome, even I must admit, but I ignored him and went back to the tea preparation. Tea takes all of your attention, all of your heart. If you don't give it everything you've got, it will fail you because you've already failed yourself. Once the tea was prepared and the women were enjoying it iced, I stood up and approached the conspicuous newcomer. Mr. Thompson, I take it. What can I do for you today? Most of the time, I'd start by asking what a customer likes, what a customer needs, what ailments are troubling them. I like to help people, but I was wary of Jamie. Nothing good comes from a poisoned plant, after all. Well, I'm actually here to get something from my grandmother. See, her mind is, going. I read that tea is good for dementia, and I was wondering if you had any recommendations. It's true. Studies have shown that certain kinds of teas are good at preserving brain mass, but as of yet, nothing in modern medicine is miraculous enough to reverse dementia. Still, nature works in funny ways. I went behind the front counter to examine my selection of green teas. You know my grandmother. She probably wouldn't drink this if she knew that you prepared it. I grunted in assent. none too keen on continuing our conversation. Jamie didn't seem to notice my reticence, or perhaps he didn't care. But, I'm hoping that maybe this will help patch things up between you. I think she'd really like you if she got to know you. I've always found you fascinating. I selected some Gyokuro Imperial and turned to face him, appraising his expression. The light in his eyes told me that he was using his grandmother as a pretense to come see me. Oh. Ignoring his obvious interest, I prepared the tea leaves and rang up his purchase, explaining how they were best brewed and when to drink it for the best results. To his credit, he was very attentive, although he seemed more interested in my lips than the words coming out of them. Well, thank you for this. I'll give it to my grandmother and come back to tell you the results. You needn't bother, I retorted, anxious to get him out of my store. But he smiled in return, not a bit perturbed by my attitude. Oh, you can't get rid of me that easy, Miss Marnie. I'll be back. With that, he turned and strode out the store, the tourist still gawking at his tall, muscular frame. That was the start of all the trouble. Since that day, Jamie started coming in regularly, always asking for my recommendations, always claiming that my tea helped his grandmother heal. I sincerely doubted that, but I didn't bother correcting his ignorance. After all, it was just a facade. At the close of each purchase, he would ask me the exact same question. So, do you have any plans for the night? Most of the time, I declined to answer. I had to admit, he was patient and persistent. He never missed a day. He was also sweet, in his own way. He handed out compliments like candy, but only ever to me. Sometimes he brought in flowers, although I couldn't keep them in the store. The scent would taint the tea. He brought me sweets on occasion. It was really getting on my nerves. Finally, one day he didn't immediately ask me out. Instead, he presented me with an opportunity, one that was too good to pass up. Honestly, Marnie, I'll do anything you want to just have one date. What do I have to do? You can't afford a date with me, I assured, although the wheels in my head were already turning. Money isn't an object. Living next to my grandma all these years, you have to know my family is loaded. He flashed me his patented, arrogant grin that somehow managed to hold a certain magnetic charm. Name it, and I'll do it. I'll make you understand how serious I am. He seemed serious, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, he could be the one I'd been searching for. And if he was, oh, I'd never dared dream. I grabbed out a post-it note and began scribbling the details on it as I told him what I wanted more than anything in the world. There is a tea grown in the Fujian province of China called Da Hong Pao, or Big Red Robe. It grows so high on the mountains that only a few select tea masters are able to make it. However, what many people don't know is that there are two strands of Da Hong Pao, the kind that is sold to the public, and the rarer kind that is used in medicine and religious rituals. I glanced into his eyes, but they remained impassive. I dared to finish. I want you to get it for me. He smirked, as though he was amused by my reticence. No problem. Is it expensive? I paused to consider that question. The tea itself, no. If you tell them you need it, if you tell them I need it, they'll give it to you. Only you have to fly to China and get it yourself. They won't send it to you. You won't be able to find a trace of them outside of their own little province. They're cut off from the world, and that's what makes their tea so special. Jamie paused as if to consider this, making a very serious face and stroking his chin. Finally, he winked at me. Consider it done. My heart skipped a beat. All this time searching for the right person, and he'd been right next to me, waiting for me to notice him. Life seemed to move at a glacial pace after that. Jamie bought the tickets and set the date for 6 months after I gave him my request. During that half year, He studied Mandarin with a passion that I'd never seen in anyone else before. He'd also managed to track down a Fujianese native and begun studying the dialect. He took very careful instruction from me as to how he could find these master tea pickers. The day before he left, he came to see me, glowing with confidence as though he had already succeeded in his quest. I knew that the worst was yet to come for him, but he didn't seem concerned. Before he walked out of my store, he stood in front of me and requested, demanded, a kiss for good luck. I was so excited and flustered that I leaned forward and pecked him on the lips without stopping to think. He laughed at the blush surfacing my skin and walked out, anticipating grand adventure. Weeks passed, several of them, in fact, and yet not a word from Jamie. I tried to remind myself to be patient. After all, he had to arrive in China, hike to the mountains, and navigate his way to the secret property of the master pickers. Reaching them would take time, and that's not to mention gaining their trust. I could only hope that they would be a little more compliant when he mentioned my name. And then, a few more weeks, I noticed that Miss Thompson was too preoccupied to harass me. She seemed shaken by Jamie's absence. Not that it surprised me. He was, after all, her primary caretaker, and though she could still manage on her own at this point, she liked the company. I was beginning to think that I would never hear back from Jamie when, one morning, I arrived at the tea house to find a man sitting in front of the shop. He was an elderly Chinese man wearing traditional garb. In his arm he held a black chest. My heart stopped in my chest. When he saw me approach, he knelt in front of me and kowtowed 3 times. I inclined my head as a gesture of appreciation. Then, I opened the tea house and let him in. We didn't exchange any words, although I am fluent in both Mandarin and Fujianese. Instead, I brewed him a cup of golden monkey black tea, which he drank for ritual's sake. Once he finished his tea, he walked out the door and out of my life, but he left behind the chest. My hands shook as I lifted it, feeling its severe heft, and carried it to the back room. Locking the door and closing the blinds, I opened the chest. The first thing I saw were the bones. Each and every bone in Jamie's body sat in the chest, neatly packed into a solid mass. I took them out, one at a time, spreading them over my work table, admiring their pristine white color. I had never seen something so beautiful. Beneath the bones, separated by a wooden slot, was the tea. The small, dark green leaves with distinct golden flecks. That was how I knew they'd given me the right product. The flashes of gold were the ticket. Yes, Jamie was the one I'd been waiting for. The one I needed. The bargaining chip that got me my most precious treasure. He was a perfect sacrifice. Miss Thompson changed after Jamie was officially declared missing. It was assumed that he had died hiking in China. An inexperienced hiker can easily go missing without the proper guide, and, just like that, she found herself alone in the world. Her other children and grandchildren would have nothing to do with her. She stopped screaming at me in the mornings. She stopped coming outside at all. But I couldn't just leave her alone like that. One morning, I brought a special tea brew over just for her. When I knocked on the door, I half expected her to cuss me out, shouting obscenities and misquoting Bible verses. Instead, she led me into her kitchen, and I brewed her tea. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. After a few minutes, she spoke on her own, about how Jamie had been so taken with me, sung my praises until she herself had begun to come around, about how much she had always loved him, how her whole life had revolved around him ever since he had been born. She began crying at one point. In fact, she kept crying until I set her tea in front of her. Almost absent-mindedly, she sipped the brew and gave me a surprised look. "This is good." I smiled at her. "It is, isn't it?" It only took a few days to get Miss Thompson to agree that I should be her new primary caretaker. Of course, she didn't need much care anymore. Not after she began drinking my tea. After a few weeks, her forgetfulness, the signs of her dementia, they began to fade. She was as sharp as she'd always been. Of course, that was intentional. I do, after all, want her to live a nice, long life, full of memories of Jamie and the agony of never knowing what happened to him. It's amazing what a little tea and bone marrow can do to a person. As for me, well, I got what I wanted. I got the rare formula I need to give my tea healing powers. I got the sacrifice for those brews that require something darker, and without Miss Thompson's ranting and screaming, my mornings became much more peaceful. Which, honey, that doesn't even begin to cover what I'm capable of. My story begins in the summer of 2017. I've been working towards my dream position at work for over 10 years and finally felt it within my grasp. Walking out of the interview for it, I knew I was going to be picked. They hired me 2 days after, and I've been working happily ever since. The new position came with a hefty pay raise, which was only one of the big benefits. The other benefit being a company house. I couldn't believe it when they told me. Nothing about the position description stated I'd be getting free housing, but I wasn't going to complain. I was sent the address and was told I could move in any time I like, or not at all. The choice was mine. Nothing seemed off or sinister about it at the time, and honestly, I don't think the company actually knew the history behind the area. I talked it over with my wife, and we decided to take it. They said it was a large house set back in the woods about 25 minutes from my workplace. We had just welcomed our first child not 4 months before, and we figured the space and location would do us some good. I hired a moving crew, got everything packed, and off we went. The day we arrived, it took us a full 3 minutes to even drive down the long winding driveway to the house. They told me it would be a house, but I would actually call it an estate. The place was enormous and completely set back on its own. There was an enormous flower garden in the path, twisting and turning with beautiful plants all around. A long greenhouse spanned the length of the yard on the left side, filled with growing vegetables that we could take and eat to our pleasing. My wife and I were in awe of the whole place. It felt serene, peaceful beyond belief. It only took us a few days to settle in, and I didn't have to start work for a few more weeks. The house was actually bigger than anything we'd need. 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and an entire basement. It wasn't finished, but it was very clean and the perfect place to store our unused things. The whole house was eerily clean, almost like someone had been taking care of it for a long time. I thought it was most likely the company, waiting for someone to move in. One afternoon, while the missus and kids were taking naps, I decided to roam the grounds. I got my hiking boots and off I went. The place was completely surrounded by trees and brush, but it was very kept. The greenhouse was glistening clean and the veggies were delicious. The flower garden was wonderful and made the grounds smell great all day. I was walking around the corner of the house when I saw what looked like a small path in the trees. It was a little out of place, just a little dirt path that looked almost like an animal trail. I walked to the edge of the woods, and that's exactly what it was. It looked like someone had walked it so much that the ground had worn in its own little path. I followed it back a while when I froze. Before me lay 2 graves, dusty and dirty, with broken headstones. They were worn so bad that the names couldn't be read, but I could catch a bit of the date, 1862 to 1880 something, and 1880 to something. Why was a lone grave out here? Was there someone who visited it often? It would make sense with the amount of use the trail has seen. I was entranced by the stone when I heard a blood-curdling scream. Someone in the woods passed the grave. It scared me so bad I tripped over myself trying to hightail it out of there. I ran back towards the house and found my wife and children standing in the backyard looking for me. "What's wrong? Why do you look like you just saw a ghost?" They hadn't heard the scream, apparently. I wasn't going to make matters worse and scare them too, so I told them I thought I saw a bear.
but it was nothing. She eyed me inquisitively, but took my explanation. We went back inside to have an early dinner, and the night went by smoothly. The next morning, we woke up, and I decided to grab some vegetables from the greenhouse for breakfast. Nothing goes better with eggs than some spinach. I crept downstairs so the others could sleep a while longer. I threw on my robe and some sandals and headed out the door. As I walked towards the greenhouse, I heard something. It sounded like a low, patterned humming. Creeping closer, I could make out that it was a woman's voice, humming some kind of song. It was beautiful, soft, and almost mother-like. I could make out a dark figure through the frosted glass walls. I called out to it. Hello? The humming stopped. I walked slowly to the door and peeked in the entrance. I saw a filthy, ragged old woman looking blankly now at the produce before her. I took a step inside, and she cracked her head my direction, peering through me. She looked like she wanted to murder me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just froze. She screamed. The same scream I heard the day before. I winced and closed my eyes, and before I knew it, the screaming stopped. She was gone, and not a trace left that she was ever there. I grabbed what I needed and sprinted inside. I wanted to call the police. I should have called them, but there wasn't a good explanation for it. I didn't want to seem like a lunatic. I've heard the horror stories of getting pushed into psych wards against your will. No thanks to all that. I decided to brush it off. Maybe I was still stuck dreaming or something. I made breakfast, brought it up to my wife, and got on about my day. The grass needed to be mowed. It was almost the only thing that needed cleaned up on the whole property, except the destroyed graves. I figured maybe I could clean those up too. I got the mower out of the little shed and was going to start when I saw an old man walking up the drive. He called out to me first, asking if I was the new owner of the home. No, I don't technically own it. My company pays for it. He cut me off before I could finish. Oh, I know your company owns it. They've owned it for more than 100 years now, he said. I couldn't really believe what he was saying. The house was over 100 years old. It looked immaculate. There's not a thing wrong with it. Excuse me, you said 100 years? That can't be right. The house is perfect. Oh, I know it's perfect, he said. It's perfect because she keeps it perfect. She's the best housekeeper there is. Again, he wasn't making any sense. Who is this guy? There's not a house around for miles, so he's definitely not a neighbor. Who is she? Are you talking about the old lady I've seen around here? Does she still live on the property? I asked. Oh, she's on the property, but she's not living. She's the previous owner of the house. This was her home, along with her husband and child. Her name was Constance. The old man stood there for over an hour, describing the situation of the property to me. I had to sit down at some point, getting dizzy with everything he told me. The house was built back in the 1870s, around 1877 to be exact. Constance and her husband had just had a child and decided to build the home for their family. Her husband had more money than they could ever need, coming from an oil family. They had an amazing life, until a rival oil family paid a hitman to take him out. One day, while Constance was out of the home, men came and burned down the home with the same oil her husband made his life off of, killing both her husband and her young child. Constance came back home to a destroyed life, shattered forever. She was so distraught that she decided to join her beloved family and killed herself in the ashes of her home. Others happened upon the family days later and decided it must have been a freak accident. They buried the husband and child, but could never find the body of his wife, Constance. Over the years, people forgot about the incident, and no one paid any attention to the property. Somehow, the house was reconstructed, piece by piece, to its original glory by Constance. Her soul, torn in two, anchored to the place she loved more than anything. That's who I was seeing around the property. She was angry still that others would take up residence in her home. Apparently, sometime in the 1970s, my company found the property and was able to buy it from state. They paved the driveway into the woods, straight to the perfect home. I thanked the man for his story and set myself on a mission. I was going to show Constance that we would cherish her home just as much as she did. I went out and bought some masonry materials and supplies. I waited until later in the evening and went out to the graves. I hadn't done much like this, so I had to learn a bit online before I tried. But I started to clean up the grave sites and put the headstones back into their places. As I got to the second stone, I heard the scream. This time it was much closer. I looked past the site, out into the woods, and saw Constance. She looked angry, almost floating there, her hair suspended in the air. It's like she didn't know what I was doing out there, like she thought I was there to destroy what was left of the headstones. She started to walk towards me, then started sprinting. I was terrified. I braced for what was to come, not knowing what would happen, when my wife and kids came through the trees. Constance stopped cold. She looked confused. My wife came up to me, kissed me on the cheek, and gave me our child. We stood there for a while. I don't think they could see her, but I did. I could see her demeanor change. She could see how happy we were, and then she looked down to see I was actually trying to restore her family's headstones. I gave my kid back to my wife, fixed up the second stone, and looked up. Constance had changed. She looked beautiful, nothing like before. She had long blonde hair, flowing past a stunning maroon silk dress. This was the actual Constance, the one that loved her family and home just as much as I do mine. She nodded at me and turned, walking into the dense woods. I wish I could tell you that's how it ended, but it's not. I thought that maybe the nightmare of my story would be Constance, but it wasn't. It's not even close to what happened a few weeks later. When you're parents, you'd do anything for your kid and your wife. I know that. Constance knew that. That's why she stayed on the property. She wanted to look after her family and home as long as she could. I would do the same, I have to say. Anyway, after I had the last encounter with Constance, things were amazing for a few weeks. The job was going well, the home was working out perfectly, and I would see Constance occasionally around the property, sometimes humming in the garden, sometimes checking on us through the large family room window. Never creeping, always just on the edge of the woods. It was nice, actually. I felt like we were doing right by her. She was wronged, and it's the least we could do to help her find peace. One night, after work, I came home to find the front door cracked open. Nothing too alarming. I'm sure it just blew open a bit. I walked in, and things were very quiet. No clinking in the kitchen, no TV in the living room, nothing. I put down my things and walked into the dining room. The table was almost set, but things were missing. As I walked around the table, I found my wife. She was out cold on the floor. I yelled for her, but she wasn't waking up. That's when I heard our child. I heard them crying upstairs, and some frantic shuffling in the same room. I lunged up the stairs and swung down the hallway into their room. I stood in the doorway to find a masked man holding my child, halfway out the window. He took one look at me and jumped out onto the first-floor roof. I ran immediately to the window as the man fired a few shots behind him towards me. I ducked back inside, then peeked and saw him running around the backside of the house. I hurried back downstairs to chase him, my heart beating in my throat like a drum. I made it out of the front door when I heard another shrill, blood-curdling scream. This time, though, it was not Constance. I dashed around the side to find our child lying in the grass. Not a scratch on him. In front of me, through the woods, I could hear branches snapping, and the now faint screaming of the man. I knew we were going to be safe. My wife had woken up from the ruckus upstairs and outside, and had called the police before coming to look for us. She ran over and embraced us. Apparently, he had only knocked her out before she had time to scream, so he could make his way upstairs. The police arrived, and we gave our report. I told them that I thought maybe I scared him off, and he left our kid laying in the grass. They decided to look for him in the direction I last saw him running. What they found was short of a horror movie. The man was impaled on a tree, about 3/4 of the way up. He had burns all over his body, like he'd been thrown into a blazing house fire. It took some poking around, but apparently this same man had been taking kids from different states for a while, and sadly, none of them ended up as lucky as mine. The police ruled us out as suspects in his murder, but I'm not so sure they even looked that hard into it. He got what was coming to him, in their eyes. As night grew nearer, the police wrapped up and asked if we would be okay, or if we wanted one of the officers there for the night. I started to think about it when I gazed past the cruisers. There was Constance, at the edge of the woods, her hands looking decrepit and almost claw-like. They quickly went away, looking completely normal. She looked at me, smiled, and nodded, then went back into the woods. I told the officers I think we would manage fine. Things have been great now. It's been years since the incident, and there hasn't been anything major again. There was the time a rabid dog found its way to the property as our child was playing outside, but I'm not sure what happened to it. They just came back to the house after playing and told my wife and I that Constance helped them with a mean doggy today, and she wasn't going to let the dog hurt them. We smiled and got set to make dinner. We go out to the graves often, cleaning them up and plant different flowers. I built a nice bench for us and Constance, so she could spend as much time as she wants there. I was going to have the gravestone professionally refurbished, but she doesn't seem to like others out at the site. It makes her a bit angry, and I start to see the old Constance. And let me tell you, I don't think I want to be on her bad side again.
I don't believe in witches, but that they're real. They're real. This is a phrase I often heard said when I was a child growing up in the north of Chile, a long and narrow country in the southernmost area of the American continent. A magical land with unforgiving deserts at the north, dark and impenetrable forests in the south, and enormous icy blue glacials reaching the south end of the world. The north of Chile, where I grew up, is a desert area where the soil itself is filled with chemicals, such as peroxide, that kill anything trying to grow in it. But these same sterile soils are filled with riches and minerals, especially silver and copper. And because of this wealth in mineral resources, there has been a mining industry in the area since the late 19th century, even before big cities and the resources needed for them arrived in those areas. The north of Chile is filled with ancient legends and mysteries. People are often lost in the desert and never found, or return several years later, looking just as they did when they disappeared, still believing it is the very day when they went missing. Strange voices of centuries-old battles are still heard. Terrifying creatures roam the dunes, and, of course, beings not from this world are often seen by people working in the copper mining operations. But those are all stories for another time. Before these mysteries populated the minds of the local folklore and superstition, people already spoke of witches in their infernal Black Sabbath, where they would commune with darkness incarnate and surrender themselves to the most wicked of perversions the human mind can conceive. Child sexual abuse, torture, cannibalism, animal and human sacrifice, etc. In Chile, when someone speaks of witches, it is a neutral pronoun, for there are female as well as male witches, both equally abominable, both working to spread misery wherever they went, turning people away from the righteous path and towards a life of hedonism and self-destruction, because that's ultimately what darkness seeks,
to drag you through feces and destroy your very soul, while you smile and ask for more. It is said witches fly towards their black Sabbath on Friday nights during the new moon when the skies are dark, only lit by the soft glow of the distant stars on a branch of the Milky Way we can see, which when seen on moonless desert nights, looks as if the night itself was a living being, exposing its backbone to us. These witches don't fly on a broomstick as many people think European witches do. These witches don't fly on a broomstick as many people think European witches do. Oh no. These witches meet in caves deep in the mountains, in ravines and crevices where normal-sized people would have a hard time fitting in, where only children could maneuver their way around or get lost forever. Instead of broomsticks, these witches turn themselves into strange birds. Some say these birds look like very large cows or like black vultures, while others claim these strange creatures, which the Amerindians call tutu, are instead the very heads of the witches, which they detach from their bodies by means of dark craft, with a necromantic vest made of human skin, the skin of someone who loved them and whom they loved. The grotesque transformation was invoked, ears turning into large black wings and their veins and viscera hanging as it would on a decapitated head turn into birds' feet with sharp and strong talons, with which they can steal children whose parents were careless and look away if only for a moment. But not all babies that were stolen ended up eviscerated and devoured, with their skin becoming soft leather, or their fat being used for candles and Chthonic rituals. The very lucky ones got to live a life of constant hell, becoming an Imbanchi, a twisted and deformed creature of pain and sorrow, with their hands and legs broken and then mended in unnatural contortions, in a way the human body was never meant to move. These monstrosities would become guards at the entrance of the witches' cavern system. It is said that sometimes, on moonless nights, you can hear the witches cry out as they fly by, a horrible scream of agony and joy. And when you hear them, you must say this to them. Fly by, devil bird. You are already late. Jesus Christ came by earlier, and he has already won the race. I have personally never seen or heard of these devil birds, these witches. But my grandmother once told me the story of one of her family members, before she was born, who had a close encounter with these things, and the horror she endured haunted her for the rest of her life. This story is based on real events. My grandmother told me about her great-aunt, who once lived in the small town of Salamanca, a mining village of barely 12,000 people in present day and perhaps only 1,000 people in the late 19th century when these events took place. Salamanca was in a semi-deserted area, with 2 rivers nearby that allowed some vegetation to grow. Back then, most people were poor and didn't have many options to make a living. If you were a woman, you found yourself a good husband who hopefully didn't beat you too harshly. And if you were a man, you found yourself a mining job, risking your life every day in dark tunnels, only to earn barely enough to feed your family, and often dying before your time, buried alive when one of those tunnels collapsed, or from lung cirrhosis after decades of breathing toxic substances. My grandmother's great-aunt was one of the lucky women who found herself a good husband, a hard-working man who didn't drink and didn't beat her, and only wanted to save enough from his work to one day own some land of his own, land he could leave to his children. He had been working since he was 12 years old. This was the way it was back then, when kids as young as age 10 were forced to earn a living and help around the house, as feeding hungry bellies was more important than earning an education that could help better their lives. In spite of all the challenges, They were happy. They had met when they were both teenagers, at church. Soon they were married and they moved together to Salamanca so he could find work as a miner. They had hopes for the future, and within a short time of moving to their new home, she became pregnant with their first child. Pregnancy, and especially the time after childbirth, are the most dangerous moments for a woman and child when dealing with darkness and its minions. Witches crave the tender, soft flesh of a newborn baby, and they enjoy driving a fragile woman to madness and despair. But my grandmother's great aunt held on to her faith, traditions, and superstitions. Even though she heard the bone-chilling cries of those devil birds on moonless nights, far off in the distance and getting closer, she knew what to say. And she always held on to her baby, knowing if she would let go of him for an instant, the witches would have him for supper. Years went by of happy and simple life, a hard-working couple with faith for the future, living one day at a time. Their baby grew up soon. Too old to be carried away by the witches now. He was now 9 years old. Her womb desired to be a mother again, so they conceived another baby, this time a baby girl. And once again their house was filled with jingles and nursery songs. And once again they had to worry about devil birds, witches, and their sharp iron teeth, their blood-curdling screams, and not knowing if one day they'd close their eyes just for a second too long, and their baby would be gone forever. Their first son had grown up too fast. He was a smart boy who did well in school, with an inventive and curious mind, just like every other kid of his age. It wouldn't be too much longer till he would have to abandon school and find work at a farm or in the copper mines. He wished it could be different, but that's just how things were back then. My grandmother's great aunt wished it would be different too. She wanted him to study and become a doctor, or perhaps a priest, someone who did good for the world. With his newborn little sister at home, the boy felt like a big man already. He had no more time for thinking about childish games, even though he missed a time of careless existence, and now he missed his mother's hugs and kisses. She was looking away from him, looking to her newborn baby. He felt it, and he knew he was no longer her little baby anymore. One morning, before her husband went up to go to work, she woke up to make breakfast for her family. She noticed the door on the back of their little adobe house was left open, and her heart sank to her stomach. Had someone come into their house? She went to check again on her little baby girl. She was safe and sound in her crib. Next, she went to check on her young boy, and his bed was empty. Had he run away, or was he taken? It was a moonless night. Just a few moments later, the boy came through the door. Before dawn, before his father would wake up, he had walked up to the river that crossed the valley of Salamanca, the only thing that allowed any vegetation to grow in this semi-desert area of the world. He had gone to swim in the pitch-black darkness and think about his future. She scolded her boy for being so careless and for leaving the door open like that, knowing fully well what superstitions say. And for going alone into the night, because even if witches thought him a bit stale for their taste, there were still plenty of bad people who wouldn't think twice of hurting a young kid wandering the streets at night. But she was happy. Happy he hadn't run away as she suspected. After being scolded, the boy replied, "Mom, I don't want to be a miner. I don't want to work on a farm. I want a better life." Saying these words in a calm and gentle voice, barely above a whisper. His mom understood how he felt. She hugged and tried to comfort him. "What would you like to do instead?" she asked him, knowing their options were extremely limited. I don't know. I want to study, perhaps travel and see the world. I want a chance for a better life. I'm sure I can think of something better than just staying here." For a moment, they held each other in silence. "Whatever you choose, I'll support you," she said, trying to show empathy, and knowing fully well what his only real options were, hoping he'd come to his senses. Days went by, and with them also the phases of the moon. She didn't have to worry about the devil birds for a little while, but she felt in her heart that her boy would truly run away soon, before he was even 10 years old. She told her husband her concerns, and together they decided it was time for him to talk some sense into the boy. Show him the value of hard work, because sooner or later, at 10 or 16 years old, he'd have to learn it. My great-granddad's husband took his son to the mines with him, to show him how being inside these tunnels and crevices wasn't so bad. "You're right. Life in these tunnels isn't too bad," the boy said, while coyly smiling, perhaps accepting his fate. Nearly a month went by, and things were normal. The family would be together for dinner, go to church together, living a life of normal and expected. But soon, the moonless nights would return. It was the first night of the new moon, and they all went to bed early, leaving their candles on until they'd fallen asleep, as if the soft golden glow of a single candle illuminating a cold room could hold back the vast darkness of the moonless night outside. Suddenly, appalling screams that sounded like the shrill cries of a baby or the desperate pleas of a dying man woke them up. The candles had gone out, and a misty, chill air floated through the house. The screams were getting closer and closer, and then, suddenly, thuds loudly fell on the roof, breaking the shingles with loud cracks. Multiple, petrifying, horrific screams came from the roof. She got out of bed, waking up her husband, both trembling with fear. The cradle with her little baby girl was next to them. The little girl woke up as well, crying loudly as those things outside. She tried to light her candle, but it wouldn't light up. He tried as well, but it was as if that misty chill floating around them kept any fire, any light from igniting. Suddenly, the screams were coming from inside the house, shrill and stupefying sounds only comparable to a nightmare. She picked up her baby, and her husband went in front of her. Grabbing a hammer he kept nearby, naively thinking this could serve as a defense in case those things got too close. They headed towards their son's bedroom, walking in the darkness, tripping over the little furniture they had, making their way towards their boy so they'd all be together. They made it into the boy's room. As he lay in bed awake, the family sat together on the bed in pitch-black darkness, recognizing each other only by instinct and each other's body warmth and shape. The birds kept screaming, now walking inside of the house, getting closer and closer towards them. In total darkness, the family realized they were under siege. The room soon was filled with these devil birds coming to take the little baby girl. The father got up and swung his hammer towards the sound of the devil birds, without thinking twice, only hoping wild action could give his family a fighting chance. And then she felt small hands taking away her baby. In just an instant, she couldn't even fight it. It was only a quick pull, and her treasured child was out of her arms. She couldn't see, only feel intense terror, imagining the future of her precious baby. From outside of the house, the parents heard a scream. This time not one of the devil birds, but one equally horrifying. It was their boy, screaming. He was being taken away. "Mother?" he screamed, as we all call for our mother when overwhelmed by fear. And suddenly, the house was empty, except for the two parents.
The devil birds were simply no longer there. They had vanished like a shadow, as silent and swiftly as an evil thought. They heard distant screams once again, getting farther away every second. They were heading towards the mountains, towards the old tunnels and caves. They couldn't believe what just happened. They just knew they had to get their kids back, no matter the cost. The parents ran as fast as they could towards the mountains where the mines were, and where superstition said the caves of the witches were as well. They arrived at the feet of the mountain, the entrance to the tunnels, and in the darkness they entered, holding each other's hand, hoping their love would protect them. They walked deeper and deeper into the tunnel, only following sounds of distant crying of children. Finally, they arrived in a chamber the hard-working miners didn't know existed in those tunnels. Torches lit up a circle around them, and a tall man wearing a black robe faced away from them. They saw the man had their young boy by the throat, but there were no signs of their baby girl.
"Let him go, you motherfucker, or I swear to God I will fuck you up,"
said the husband, always a tough man. He took steps forward towards the man in the black robe, but no matter how much he walked forward, he didn't move at all. My great-grandaunt was paralyzed by fear, still standing on the threshold of the chamber, observing this terrible scene. The man in the black robe turned around to face them, his face obscured by the long hanging robe over his eyes, but they could see he was an old man, with long bony hands and very white skin.
"Let's make a deal,"
said the man in the black robe. "I'll let your boy go, in exchange for you," he said. The tough man, hard-working father and husband didn't think twice. He nodded and got closer to the man in the black robe, this time actually being able to move closer.
"I'm here. Let go of my son now,"
said the father. "Come closer," said the man in the black robe. The father obeyed him, now face to face with the man in the black robe. The father tried to raise his hands and strangle the man in the black robe, but something prevented him from doing it. It's not that something held his hands back. Instead, it was as if his arms didn't respond to his commands at all. Then, the father felt a sharp pain on his chest. A ritual dagger was cutting him till its tip reached his backbone. The man in the black robe twisted the dagger, causing the father unbearable pain. At this moment of agony, the father noticed the low angle of the stab wound, and he closed his eyes and opened them again, having a revelation more horrendous than the certain death that awaited him. There was no old man in the black robe. The one who had stabbed him was his son. The boy held on to the dagger, his father's blood dripping down his arm. The mother, still paralyzed by the threshold of the chamber, screamed and screamed until her throat was raw.
Why?
Asked the father, as he felt life slipping away from him.
"I want to fly,"
said the boy, opening his mouth and revealing sharp iron teeth, grinning widely in an unnatural way. So many teeth, so sharp and so big, they couldn't possibly fit in his mouth. The boy looked at his mother standing in the back, and he said, "Mommy, I figured out what I want to do with my life." His mother looked at him with terror in her eyes, as he smeared his father's blood on himself, finally washing away the baptism which he had first washed away in the river at night on a moonless night. The boy began to vomit, not food, but his own insides, his guts coming out of his mouth, the flesh around his neck detaching as torn flesh, his ears growing and turning into large black wings, his head turning into a monstrous bird and his body falling to the floor, vanishing before touching the ground. The mother turned around and ran into the night, crying and unable to contain her anguished screams. Her son was no longer her boy, and her little baby was ripped from her arms. She found her way out of the tunnel and ran back to town, screaming for help. The next day, the people in town went looking for the missing baby girl, but after days of searching, they never found her. But they did find the skinned corpse of my great-granddad's husband. Many people believed her story, that witches had taken her children and killed her husband, while others thought she was crazy, and she must have killed her husband and drowned her children. She never told them what she had really seen and what had truly become of her son. Eventually, she left the town and moved to the capital city of Santiago de Chile. After years of solitude, still being an attractive woman, she remade her life and found a measure of happiness with a new husband, a kind and wealthy widower with children from his previous marriage. But still, my grandmother told me that her great-aunt dreamt about what had happened often for the rest of her life. And on moonless nights, when those wicked witches and devil birds could be heard screaming in the distance, she heard them and could clearly hear a word in their screams. Perhaps she imagined it, but among the cacophony of screams, she could clearly hear one of the voices that shouted, "Mother,